Starting in 3, 2, 1.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. I have to note that we have a remarkable number of people in the audience. So perhaps this is really a testament to how important is this topic. So first and foremost, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining the session on how can we design cities for women. Thanks also to the NLA for hosting us as part of London Festival of Architecture. My name is Marina. I'm a Principal Planning Policy Officer at LLDC, and here with me today is my colleague Tiffin Kergusian. She will chair the panel discussion of this session. For those who might not be familiar, very briefly, LLDC's development agency set to deliver regeneration of the Olympic area in East London. So both Tiffin and I are part of LDC Safety of Women and Girls Project Board. The urgent issue of safety of women and girls in public spaces had led LDC to set up this board to review the approach to gender equality in public spaces and give this a specific focus. And really, working on this project is that we very soon realized how complex is this topic and how much more there is for us to learn about it as a profession. And this really is the reason why we are here today. So how can we design cities for women and girls? A very catchy title and a very big and a brave question. And we almost certainly won't be able to answer this question in full today, but we thought let's be brave and let's start a conversation. And we have a huge audience here today, so we want to also plead others to carry on this conversation and start unpacking perhaps elements that we won't be able to cover here today in just an hour and 45 minutes. I also need to say that this is not a conversation just about designing cities for women and girls. Inadequately designed urban environment can make life difficult for everyone, but it does disproportionately affect women and girls. And we also know that by improving the experience of women is beneficial for everyone using the space and can lead to creating inclusive and welcoming environment for everyone. So this morning, with our brilliant speakers, we'll be looking to unpack at least some element of how urban design affects women and girls at different levels and learn about some solution to this problem. But before we go to this, I thought it would be fair if I set out at least some of the key issues that we are actually looking to address through application of these design approaches. So, and the first point I think we really need to start from is urging issue of safety and perception of safety of women and girls in public realm. It is fair to say that I wish we did not have to discuss topic of safety, but statistics are absolutely compelling us to action. And I'm only going to mention one data that really resonates with me. So the recent UN data has shown that 71% of women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment in public spaces. And this is raising to 86% of those 18 to 24 years old. And it is really due to this concern about personal safety that women and girls tend to adopt avoidance strategy, which can really impact their ability to engage in employment, education, as well as social and leisure activities. And in my view, this is a definition of inequality. And perhaps maybe the part for this is because our cities have traditionally been designed by men and for men. In the UK, only 30% of all architects are women, and this percentage reduces drastically when looked at the senior position. And really the influence of this approach to design can be seen all around us in lack of public toilets, distribution of land uses across neighborhood, as well as infrastructure and public transport network. And we know that women are way more likely to be engaged in unpaid caring work, caring for children and elderly. And this distribution of land uses and infrastructure can really make this responsibility extremely difficult. And while, of course, it's important that we address underrepresentation of women within the industry, another thing that we really need to be mindful of is that women and girls are also underrepresented in designing and decision-making process. Public participation today seems to be a norm, I think, across the globe. But when we actually analyze the data and the demographic data of those who are engaging in that process, I think we very often see that, well, let's say it, we are actually engaging with mainly educated white men. And of course, it's very important that that our public engagement is more inclusive, but we also need to address that women and girls are not one entity or homogeneous group. And that, I guess, reflects really for everyone. Intersectionality influences how one perceives, but also how it uses built environment. And the very final point for me is to say that, and I guess we really need to recognize that inequality is spatially reinforced by design. I think we know that, we've seen that, there are a lot of examples. But the issue of gender inequality is all-encompassing and goes way beyond responsibility of one profession or one sector. Any intervention should require an integrated and coordinated approach across a range of different sectors and professions, and I would really here say particularly including education and social services. So on that note, today we're going to hear from the speakers to discuss how gender equality approach in urban design can help us to create inclusive and safer urban environments. But before we actually go to this, I also just want to say that today's session is very much about learning from each other. And I'm sure that among our audience, there is a wealth of knowledge. So during our panel discussion, we would like you to tell us, well, challenge our thoughts, tell us the amazing project you are working on, ask the questions. If the time permits, we would like to take some of the questions, but we do have packed agenda. So let's see if we come to that. So I would now like to invite our first speaker, Sara Candiracci. She's Associate Director at Arup, and she's leading on an incredible piece of work called Designing Cities for and with Women as a Global Initiative. So Sara, over to you. I am mindful that I need to now share my screen, so please everyone just bear with me. So one moment. Okay, now I need to figure out how to extend this. So one tiny second.
I think you just need to close, right?
Right.
Yeah, and then on the left.
Here we are. Thank you. And just one moment. Okay. Okay, Sara. Well, now over to you.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to this extremely important event. And to, as you said, I think we are here all to learn from each other, because it's definitely a very complex topic, which requires these moments to exchange knowledge and also different perspectives. So let me see if it works. Yeah, it's working. Thanks. So going back. Yeah. So hi everyone. No, sorry. How does it go back?
Is it going back?
Okay. Yeah, perfect.
Are you there?
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm
Thank
here.
you.
Yeah,
Sorry for this.
Yeah, no problem.
Brilliant.
So as Marina said, I'm Sara Candiracci. I'm an urban planner and social researcher's background. I work at ARU, where I'm leading the work on inclusive and resilient cities, and also, as Marina said, work on gender sensitive design and planning. And today I would like to share some insights from our work that we are doing in collaboration with other partners, which are UNDP and the University of Liverpool. For those who don't know, Arup is a firm of design and planning. It's a multidisciplinary firm. We have planners, designers, engineers, social researchers, and we work across every aspect of today's built environment. And as urban professional, we know that the planning and design and management decisions that cities make have a huge impact on women's well-being, safety, and personal development. And so it's very important. We feel very responsible to take action on that, and to make sure that we are able to incorporate gender-sensitive approaches and principles in our work. Okay, sorry, I'm here. So, but I'd like to start by explaining why gender-sensitive design is critical. So we know that Marina already shared some important data, statistics, and because we know that across the world, women of different ages and gender identities face a range of barriers and vulnerabilities, which include gender-based discrimination, inequality, violence, poverty, unpaid care work, limited control over assets, and also unequal participation in private and public decision making. But we also know that by involving women and by considering their needs, the challenge they see in cities, and also the aspiration, we can actually create more inclusive, equal, and sustainable urban environments that work better for everyone. In fact, we know that when women design and plan for cities, they have inclusivity in mind. Okay, so I like to add some more statistics to what Marina said, just to share a bit of the frame, a bit the scale of the challenge that we have to deal with. So in the UK, 97% of young women have experienced sexual harassment in public. In India, only 20% of women are employed. In Brazil, 12% of trans women have been assaulted in public restrooms. And across the EU, women earn 37% less than men. And in the built environment profession, only 16% of employees are women, and globally, only 29% of women are in decision-making positions. So it's quite clear that for the past decades, government authorities and urban practitioners, we have all failed to consider gender-sensitive approaches in our work, and also to address the needs and aspirations of women in decision-making and in city planning. So this is why we, as Arup, we're working in partnership with UNDP and the University of Liverpool to better understand how to better design cities for and with women. So it's our aim through our work is to generate, first of all, evidence on the diversity of challenges and opportunities that women see and face in cities around the world. We are considering different age groups. We are considering different ethnicities, geographies, sexual orientation, identities. And at the same time, the main purpose of our work is to identify actionable solutions or strategies that city leaders, urban planners, community groups can use to create safe, inclusive, equable built environments. Our research is ongoing. It will be captured in a publication that we're going to launch at the end of September, and it will be available online, and it will be accessible and free for everyone to use. So based on, just to give you some insight from our research, so we saw that based on our research, most of work publication focusing on designing cities for women are mainly focusing on safety and security in cities. This is definitely a critical aspect, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient if you really truly want to design cities for women, because women are complex human beings and with different personalities, the needs and aspirations. So it's very important to consider this complexity when we say that we design cities for women. So in our research, we're using a holistic and systemic approach and also very highly participatory. And we frame our work considering 4 key dimensions that we saw that could be like a good entry point to have this holistic understanding of women's needs and aspiration in cities. The first dimension is about health and well-being. So we are looking at how the built environment can impact the health and well-being of women, including their access to green spaces, quality housing, healthcare facilities, sanitation, nutrition, and also spaces for physical exercise and for mental well-being. The second dimension is about self-actualization and enrichment. So basically how the built environment can impact the independence and sense of self for women of different ages and different identities. So we're looking at the access to enriching work and education opportunities, access to education and cultural leisure and activities, also social interactions and inclusive spaces. Then we are looking at safety and security because it's extremely important. So how the built environment can impact the safety of women, including from a policy perspective, from a safe public transport perspective, also the existence of campaigns, urban design lighting features, social services, and local support networks. And lastly, we're looking also at justice and equity. So basically how the built environment can impact the lives of women through legislation and gender equity policy, looking also at the gender budgeting, representation and participation in decision making and planning and data management. So we're using also a highly participatory approach in our research. So as I said, we're considering different urban contexts, different geographies, as we know that to consider that there is a need, as Marina also mentioned, to consider different disciplines and views to fully understand existing challenges and opportunities, and also to treat as equally important governance, infrastructure, behaviors when thinking and designing cities for women. So for each of these 4 dimensions, we identify key challenges that women are facing across cities around the world, and so also some ideas and solutions and practical actions that can be implemented by city makers and embed in their work. For instance, in the under health and well-being, we saw that key challenges are related to lack of access to inclusive water and sanitation facilities, gender data bias in healthcare, lack of inclusive and accessible play and exercise spaces. And so for the challenge that we identify, there are more than this, but it's just a brief summary. For each challenge, then we identify different solutions, possible solutions, and we got inspired from different best practice case studies implemented across the world, and that from which we can learn and also exchange these ideas. For instance, to address the lack of inclusive and accessible play and exercise spaces, we identify as a possible solution an initiative that was implemented in New Jersey in the US, where a not-for-profit organization named Jake's Place has created 2 all-inclusive playgrounds for children and adults for considering different abilities. And so in these playgrounds, they feature cushion surface, wide ramps, sensory activities, wheelchair access, and so forth, to basically promote accessibility and interaction across everyone. For self-actualization enrichment, we saw that key challenges that we identify are poor representation of women and girls in public spaces, limited spaces for young women, young girls in public spaces, and also lack of inclusive nightlife spaces, for instance, among others. And for instance, to address the challenge of limited spaces of young girls, among other examples, we recommend a park in Malmö in Sweden, which was designed in consultation with a group of girls aged 16 and 24. And the result of the work is an urban activity park, which is divided into a series of more spaces to avoid domination by one group. And also the girls that were involved in the consultation, the design of the park, they found the engagement so powerful that they also created an advocacy group, which is called Engage in Malmö, to help other girls and women become involved in urban planning. And under safety and security, that is the hot topic, we saw that key challenges, and we all know, is public harassment and violence against women in public spaces, poor lighting and ensure spaces, and harassment also in public transportation. And a good example comes from Scotland, where the police has launched a new campaign targeting men and boys with regard to their behavior and sexual entitlement. There is a campaign called That Guy campaign, which is basically a 60-second video which encourages boys and men to engage in conversations with themselves, with family members and friends who may be contributing to a culture that endangers, minimizes and brutalizes women. And under the last dimensions about justice and equity, we saw that key challenges, among others, are that staff in local authorities in many cases are not trained on gender issues. There is lack of safeguarding against violence and abuse, and also the fact that also Marina mentioned that over the past decades, cities have been designing around the default male profile, basically a man that is 30 years old, fit and efficient at work. So to address in particular this critical last challenge, we have the good example from Vienna, where gender mainstreaming is at the forefront of the urban planning agenda. In fact, at present, approximately 60 gender-sensitive pilot projects have been implemented, and a further 1,000 have been assessed. In Vienna, streets and public spaces are named for and by women, and this symbolic approach makes a statement about the importance of considering women and their needs in design and planning. So basically, through our work, what we really want to provide is really a holistic approach to city design and planning from a gender perspective, from a women perspective, and with a women point of view. And we want to really provide recommendations that different stakeholders can adopt to make cities a caring space, a healthy space, an active environment, which is inclusive, culturally rich, which is safe and supportive, that provide equal access to justice, decision-making, data management to all women of different ages and identities. And to conclude, my last slide is coming up. So, and I like to conclude by saying that when designing cities for with women, when we design cities for with women, there are so many variables which make it difficult to find solutions that work for all contexts, geographies, and also gender identities. In fact, women across the globe, we use cities in different ways, depending on factors like cultural norms, religion, governmental policies, and also women have different needs from cities through their life, from child, adolescent, worker, pregnant woman, maternity, older person. We all have different needs. So the situations, the topic is very complex. So that's why a multidisciplinary approach, a collaboration is much needed. So there is not one solution that fits for all. That doesn't exist, but definitely with our publication, what we want to achieve is really to provide recommendation, to provide inspiration for solutions that comes from all over the world, and to make sure that this work is implemented. We need to listen, to adapt the solution. We need to listen to work with women in the places where we work and adapt the solution based on their specific needs. And also we need to be open and definitely have an holistic approach. And I will conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm definitely very much looking forward to reading this report. It is indeed very comprehensive and food for thoughts for, I think, the whole industry. So, well, going now from global to a little bit more local, we're going to hear from Pablo Navarrete Hernandez, who is a lecturer at the Department of Landscape Architecture at University of Sheffield. And the research he is going to tell us a little bit more about, I think, is absolutely great and very important. He talks about safety and perception of safety, or actually perception of safety, how gender influences that, and what intervention within urban environment we can do to address this issue. Pablo, over to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me get control. Okay.
Yeah, just take your time.
Let me go back to the first slide. I think I'm moving forward.
Okay. I think here you are. Perfect. Well, okay, now.
Thank you for the invitation. My presentation is called Evidence-Based Strategies to Close the Gender Gap in Fear. So I would first, essentially the presentation has 5 parts. First, I will answer why does fear of crime matter. Then I would present evidence from 3 papers, 2 of them published in Landscape and Urban Planning, and another one under review in the Journal of Environmental Economics. And then finally, I would end up with some conclusions. So why does fear of crime matter? So crime prevention through environmental design is a strategy that aims essentially to reduce crime and therefore it targets the mindset of the perpetrator. And by doing so, by reducing crime, is supposed to reduce as well fear of crime. However, research shows that there is a very weak correlation between crime rates and fear of crime. That means that, to put it simple, you can have a neighborhood when you dramatically decrease crime rates, but fear of crime remain unchanged. Since they are different constructs, it may be the case that they may need different intervention strategies. Second, women are more concerned about personal safety and are more likely to take safety precaution measures. So therefore, fear is not just an emotion, but has very tangible behavioral responses and therefore reinforces gender inequality. So for instance, it restricts more often women mobility in terms of the hour of travel, the route that they would take, the mode of transport and destination. Also affects physical and mental health because it favors a more housebound lifestyle, and therefore it affects physical activity and leads to chronic stress and anxiety. But also it affects the whole geography of access to opportunity in terms of restricting time and space access, for instance, to employment, schooling, opportunities for socializing and recreation, and where women would start a business. So what we can do to reduce fear? So essentially, crime prevention through environmental strategies propose that by changing the built environment, we could reduce crime, and therefore that should have a spillover on fear of crime. So we published this paper in Landscape and Urban Planning, where we essentially test 3 environmental approaches. The first one is Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street, which essentially proposed that nature surveillance would deter crime, and by doing so, it would reduce fear of crime as well. Broken Windows proposed that dilapidated public spaces are a magnet for crime and therefore increases fear of crime. And finally, there is a whole movement proposed by the UN about the incorporation of public toilets in public spaces. So the strategy that I use in all my papers is randomized controlled trials, a strategy that comes first from the field of medicine, but now is widely used in economics and social science research. And I do photo simulations, essentially taking images from the spaces as they are, as in the image below. And then I modify them with a photorealistic approach, essentially doing an intervention, in this case, deleting a graffiti. And that is randomly assigned to a group of population that would rate one of these 2 images. So in this experiment, there are image 1 and 2 would be an intervention that remove the graffiti from the public space. 3 and 4 would essentially incorporate a public toilet of different size. And image 5 and 6, it would be the replacement of a blind wall with a housing block that has windows facing to the street. So the first finding, and this is a super important finding, is that men and women can feel equally safe in well-maintained, well-designed spaces. About the impact of crime prevention through environmental design, it works, and it works particularly for women. And among the 3 interventions, the one that we found robust evidence to support the intervention is actually removing, or in the first place, preventing blind walls in the public space. So then we know that crime prevention through environmental strategies can help, but can we go beyond that? So the idea is here tap into the psychology of fear and test one intervention that is nature-based solutions. So to explain a little, emotions, they have 2 components. One is the emotional experience, which is the conscious part. So when you think, oh, I am afraid. And then there is the emotional expression, which is the whole set of physiological reactions that occurs when you are afraid. So for instance, increasing heart beating, pupil dilation, sweating, and so on. So crime prevention through environmental design, there are strategies that tackle this conscious emotional experience. And by doing so, it attempts to reduce fear. However, two-factor theory proposed that actually there is a feedback mechanism between emotional expression and emotional experience. For instance, when power poses would make people feel confident after a while. So the idea is to tap on the essentially relaxation impact of nature-based solutions to inhibit the emotional expression of fear. And by doing so, changing the conscious experience of fear. So a very kind of risky but interesting question. And we compare these nature-based solutions with more experience-based solutions, crime prevention through environmental design, essentially these 2 main theories. So in terms of, we model this in dilapidated public spaces in Milan. And what we find, if you see graph 2, essentially nature-based solution worked. And in graph 3, essentially they work at least as well as crime prevention through environmental design strategy. Then we see that they work across all the spaces except in tunnel and underpasses. And more importantly, it works for men and women, and the impact increases with the quantity of greenery that you are adding to public space. So now we know that experience strategies and expression strategies may work, how we put all together in space. So for that, we propose a new method. We take as an example a high crime area in Santiago de Chile. This is Marta Brunet, where we took images from different public spaces that are geotagged and residents rate them. And with that, we built a heat map about the fear of crime in that neighborhood. As we see, there is not an equal distribution in space. As you can see in graph B, women overall feel more afraid in public spaces than men in this neighborhood. And as you can see here, the interesting part is that the location of these spaces is the same. So what are high fear spaces are the same for men and women. So we do a little bit of statistical analysis, and we are able to restrict what are the high crime areas, and therefore where public investment should go to change these spaces. Then the Ministry of Housing in Chile has a regeneration strategy of public space. We model all the interventions in these spaces, and then we test their impact. So essentially, we discovered that half of them doesn't work. And we discovered as well that the number of interventions that works, they are essentially, there are less intervention that works for women than for men. As a result, this is essentially men are more benefited by the regeneration of this neighborhood. Overall, the transformation of public space makes feel safer men and women. However, since that there are more interventions that affect men, the gender disparity is preserved. So in conclusion, men and women can indeed feel equally safe in public space, but women feel significantly less safe in the deteriorated spaces. Experience-driven crime prevention strategies work to close this gap, but we can expand that toolbox by using expression-driven strategies. Regeneration of public space can make a true difference in reducing fear of crime. However, when not planned with a gender perspective, can act actually to preserve or even increase the gender fear gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo. This was extremely insightful. I was very busy taking notes, and we'll be sharing the presentations with the audience as well, because I appreciate there is a lot of data within and a little time for us to digest, and everything seems so interesting. So the next speaker we have is Susanna Walker from Make Space for Girls. Do I have to say more? I mean, the name says it all. Extremely important topic. Susanna is leading an organization that is campaigning for parks and public spaces to be designed with girls and for girls and young women, which I think is extremely important, given that this age group often really gets overlooked when designing our public spaces. So Susanna, really keen to learn from you more.
Thank you very much for having me here. We're a very different approach compared to some of the very high level looks that we've had so far. We are focusing on teenage girls in parks and public spaces, and predominantly we are working within the UK. But actually, I think by having that focus, sometimes it's easier to see the more practical solutions. I can't move the slides yet. So anyway, this is where we begin. Right at the beginning of starting Make Space for Girls, I spoke to the daughter of a friend and I said, well, do you go to the park? And she just looked at me and said, why would I go to the park? There's nothing there for me. And that's the basis of Make Space for Girls, as expressed by one teenage girl. They don't use parks and public spaces because they understand that they are not designed for them. Can I have the next slide, please? Because it's not letting me.
Oh yeah, it works for me, so let's do it that way. I apologize.
We'll do it the old-fashioned way.
Oh, okay.
So we are a charity. We've been going for about 15 months. We campaign to make parks, recreation grounds, playing fields, public spaces as welcoming to teenage girls as they are to teenage boys. And this encompasses a whole lot of stuff. So next slide, please. I'm racing through this because I've got a lot to say. So is there a problem? Yes, there is a problem. When people build facilities for teenagers in parks and public spaces, these are almost always a skate park, a mooga, a fenced pitch, or a basketball court, or a BMX track. These are all almost entirely dominated by boys. And design is a factor of that. There are other things going on as to why this happens, but it's and that is something that we can fix. But there are social and environmental factors that we can't fix. But hey, let's at least fix the design. But the important thing is not to try and fix the girls. The temptation is to go, oh, well, we've got a skate park, so let's teach the girls to skateboard, rather than going, is this actually what they want to do? Next slide, please. So Moogas, I was going very quickly. Biz is very articulate, very feisty, but she won't go into the Mooga. Let's just have a look. Basically, Moogas are not, next slide please, not designed for girls. They are high fenced spaces with narrow entrances. They don't feel safe. They can very easily get territorialized by groups of boys. It's worth saying at this point that we focus on teenage girls, but actually, if we change the built environment, we're going to make parks and public spaces inclusive for a whole range of other groups, because it's only a very small group of boys who get to dominate these spaces at the moment. Next slide, please. Skate parks, equally problematic. We do hear really quite dreadful stories from girls about having stones thrown at them, about being sexually harassed, about rape threats in skate parks. Next slide, please. Skateboarding is very male, but worse than that, skate parks actually deter teenage girls from going into the park at all. This has been proven by research in America, where how close a girl was to a park, the more exercise they did, great, unless that park was a skate park, in which their exercise levels were below average. And we've seen that played out in here. A park on the south coast asked teenage girls, what relatively cheap thing could we do to make the park better for you? And they said, put a gate in so we don't have to walk past the skate park to get out. Next slide, please. No, we've gone the other way. So why does this need to change? Yes, really quickly. Obviously, there's a social justice just in having access to public space, because otherwise public space tells girls that they should stay at home. And so this is the baseline about why we're all doing this, because access to space is being part of the community. Health, really important. And increasingly there's research showing that access to green space is really beneficial for the mental health of teenagers. Teenage girls have 3 times the mental health issues of teenage boys. They need to be in the park. Safety, we've covered already. Also the law. There's the UN Rights on the Child, which covers the right to play up to 18, but girls are not provided for. But under the Equality Act in the UK, girls have public bodies have a duty not just to address to consider equality, but to redress discrimination. And at the moment, we would argue that the discrimination is so intense that they really do have a duty to do something about it. Next slide, please. So what do teenagers say? They want a sign that they're welcome there. So skate parks tell boys they're welcome. How can we build things that tell girls they're welcome? They want to be hidden but seen. This is the eyes on the street. They really want to be around other people, but they don't want to be stared at. They want to play, and they tell us they want to play, but the only places they have to play are the little kids areas, and then they get tutted at by the mum. And as Sarah mentioned, lots of different spaces are really important because it stops one group dominating. Next slide, please. So what does better look like? We're now going to career through this. As Sarah mentioned, there's been some great work done in Europe, particularly Sweden and Vienna. These are the suggestions, but we would stress, always talk to, as Sarah was saying, intersectionality plays a huge part. It's really important to consider the issues in a particular area. To be blindingly obvious, you could build the most brilliant park in the world, but if girls had to go through a really terrible underpass under a 2-lane highway, they're not going to use it. So you need to look at their uses of the space, everything from gang culture to where their parents will let them go in order to achieve that. Next slide, please. Malmo, Sarah mentioned that. This is great. We'll go straight to the next slide, actually, because it's easier to talk about when you can see it. It was designed by a group of teenage girls. Malmo had a policy of building small parks in unused corners of the urban space. After they built 14 parks and 12 skate parks, they realised they were mostly being used by boys. So they gave this one over to a group of girls to design. Climbing wall, there's a stage off to the left. The performance spaces are great. Bars, parks used to have bars like this all the time and they've disappeared. Girls love them. They asked for them in Malmo. What's really worth noticing about Malmo, though, is that although it was designed entirely by and with teenage girls, it shifted the dial on usage from girls being 20% of the users to girls being 50% of the users. So that's how entrenched the discrimination is and how much work that has to be done in order to change things. Next slide, please. I'm very aware that I'm running out of time. I love this one. This is so brilliant. This is in Stockholm. It's relatively new. They've taken the space of one pitch and turned it into a playful space. Next slide, please. And what they've done as well, we build teen shelters. Teen shelters are the most miserable things in the world. And they get, again, really dominated by one group. Here, the shelter is part of the park, so you can carry on using the facilities. It's so simple. Why don't we do it? It's bright, it's colourful. Also, crucially, it's not telling you what to do. So much of what we build for teenagers is didactic. Skate here, play football here, but actually they want to play and hang around, and this is the kind of space you can do it. Next slide, please. Stages, great. This is in Vienna, lovely, also a community asset. Next slide, please. The one thing that girls want more than anything else is swings. Obviously, we can't afford to build this, but this is something that tells girls that they are welcome in the park, and it's fantastic. And so the more, and it's frankly, it's a lot, even this is probably cheaper than a skate park. So this, we put this on Twitter and all the grown-ups were going, actually, I don't care about teenage girls, send me to this. We need something like this. So there are so many more creative, playful things we can do for teenage girls. So let's do them. Thank you. That was really quick. I haven't got time to go on. Superkilling is lovely though. All of these case studies are on our website. We're really happy to talk to people about them. We're really happy to do CPD for people. Please get in contact.
Thank you so much, Susanna. I'm really sorry that you didn't have enough time to cover everything because everything is super important and interesting, but we will be definitely looking forward to dive a little bit more into this topic during our panel discussion. So last but not least, we're going to hear from Terry Okoro, who is a mayor's design advocate, and she'll be joined by Ellie Cosgrove. She's director at Publica, and they will tell us a little bit more about work that Mayor of London is doing that is looking at the role of design in creating safer public realm for women, girls, and gender minorities. I do apologize for a little hiccup with our IT. I will try to, Terry, I will try to give you access to so you can flick through the slides, but I'm here if you can't. For whichever reason, it does not allow me to do this. So I apologize to everyone, but if we can go with next slide, that will be the way to do it. Over to you, Terry.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think it's allowing me to get control, so I'll have to depend on you. Thank you. So I'm Terry Okoro. I'm an architect who's passionate about inclusion in design, policy, and processes, and I'm also Mayor's design advocate, as was mentioned. So I'm here representing the Mayor for London and the Greater London Authority, and I'll be presenting alongside Ellie Cosgrove from Publica. So we're working together on a piece of research for the Mayor for London, which is reviewing the role of design in creating safer public realm for women, girls, and gender minorities. If I can have it, because we're already on the next slide. So this research is sitting under the GLA's Good Growth by Design program, which seeks to enhance and shape a better city, the quality of the city, and promotes inclusion also in the built environment. It's also a call for action to the built environment professionals that we need to design a city for all Londoners, as indicated in the Mayor's manifesto. Next slide, please. So supporting this program, there are 42 Mayor's design advocates, of which I'm one. The Mayor's design advocates are independent and impartial built environment professionals. We're experts. We provide support, advice, we critique. We also provide expertise on London's built environment. So for this research piece, which we're going to talk about, there's a team of 6 MDAs, including myself, who are acting as a steering group, and we're helping to shape and inform the project. So if I can have the next slide, please. So underpinning this, you can see there's a suite of documents, strategies, and policies that already exist, which sit alongside this research to design a more inclusive city. So I'd urge you all to look at them online. They're available. They're also free to download and use widely and it's used widely in the profession as key strategies to guide development. So I myself consult them, and I'm guided by them in my day-to-day practice. So moving on. So this new research, it's still ongoing, still in development, so it's early days yet, but it is about the role of design in women and girls' safety in public spaces. We know that there is a crisis in women, girls, and gender minorities' sense of safety in the public realm. We've already heard lots of other presenters discussing this today. But how can we use our role as designers, builders, planners, etc., to actually impact on change? We know that design is not the sole solution, and here on this on this slide, and I'm not quite sure if we're on the right slide. Can we go back one slide, please?
I really apologize. Let me try to see how. Are we going back? We're not.
Getting a sneak preview.
Sorry, just 1 second. I do apologize for this.
Yeah.
Do you have a left arrow you can press?
Oh,
yeah.
There you go. I do apologize. Well, that works much
yes,
better.
yes,
Please,
yes,
sorry, Terry, this must be very confusing to you.
Yeah, okay.
Where are we? Is this the right one?
It's the correct slide. Yeah.
Perfect.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. So we know that design is not the sole solution, because here you can see this quote from Leslie Kern from the Feminist City that says, "No amount of lighting can abolish the patriarchy." So, but how can our sector make an impact? What do we know already? And what can we also do to support designers? So if I have the next slide, please. So existing London plan policy states that all public realm should be inclusive and accessible to all Londoners. Plus, we're also looking at joining other policy and delivery initiatives to collaborate and understand more. But we know that as designers, there's an opportunity to understand and innovate in how design impacts safety and public spaces through place-based testing on the ground with live projects, as we saw in the research in Sheffield, but also through collating and curating the existing rich landscape of knowledge to share with the sector, because we heard from Arab about all the interesting things which are happening and the Make Space for Girls. If we can have the next slide, please. So it's important to note that we don't know the answers yet. We've designed this research program in 3 phases, each learning from the previous phase. So firstly, we've commissioned Publica to collate the best practice in research, as well as a toolkit of questions to assist the design sector at each stage of the design process, and also to encourage experimentation and participation as well, because that's quite important. The toolkit of questions which we have will then be rigorously tested in phase 2 with live development projects. And I'll let Ellie now elaborate further on this element. So Ellie, over to you.
Great, thank you. If we can move on to the next slide. This has been such a dream project for me. It's been so wonderful working with the GLA and Mayor's Design Advocates. And we've had a series of workshops and really compelling and nuanced and difficult discussions, all with the aim of coming up with this checklist of questions that can be used specifically for urban designers on projects and programs that they're developing. But what was becoming clear very early on in the desk review and the research and the project was that actually there are key principles around inclusive cities that really anyone who wants to engage with the ideas with inclusive urban development needs to be thinking about, not just urban designers. So it became apparent that we needed a kind of I like to call each of these cheat sheets, where we just explain what the key principles are and the things that you need to know. I won't go into them all, I'll just read them out. So the first one is around understanding what gender is and how do we understand gender. The second one is that we need to move from women as victims to the right to the city. I will explain that more in the next slide. An idea that we should be moving away from the idea that we have power to create a city that we can call safe for everyone. We argue that police and crime-led approaches aren't sufficient, that one size to women's safety does not fit all, that we need an intersectional approach, that we need a more inclusive sector alongside gender expertise, and a lot of these points have been mentioned already today, so I'm glad we're on the same page. A better city for women is a better city for all. And then finally, that really feminist action towards cities is about doing it differently or being willing to challenge orthodox approaches to urban development. So in the report, you will find a page on each of these, really just explaining the key principles described by the literature. And we hope that that's a really empowering tool and resource that will enable people to make their own decisions in their own context and their own environments. Next slide, please. Just to explain one of these points, the kind of the shifting perspective from women as victims to a more right to the city approach. And I think that just to explain this in a bit more depth, that a lot of the interventions or a lot of the ways in which we choose to tackle women's safety really kind of position women as helpless victims that need to be saved by usually patriarchal forces of design and policing. But really what that tends to do is entrench women's position as helpless. We can see this in, for example, the introduction of women's safety carriages, which kind of limit women's access to freedom of movement and liberation in the city, rather to think about what kinds of rather to think about the reality of a city as a place of opportunity, of vibrancy. It's a place where people go for to make connections and opportunities that they may not be able to find either within the home or in rural settings. So if we can understand the city as a kind of liberating potential, we might start to think about it as a right. For those of you who haven't heard it before, the right to the city is a collective right to reshape ourselves by reshaping the city. So acknowledging the city as a place of liberation, and also acknowledging a right to reshape the city and participate in the act of urban development to change our lived experience, our possibilities. Next slide, please. And so the way in which we think about safety, safer cities in this report is far beyond kind of fear of crime or a crime-based approach. And we understand it through three main lenses. This is freedom from violence, harassment, intimidation. The second one is accessibility, or what we kind of thinking we'll call usability, to be a bit clearer. Is this space for me? Is it designed with my needs in mind? And the final one, which we've heard a bit already about, is a sense of belonging as key to safety. Do I feel welcome in this space? And so what we're saying is that these translates into these implicit safety questions that anybody asks themselves as they're entering public realm. Do I feel I will be victimized in this space? Can I use it? And do I feel welcome or able to participate in this space? And we find that in each of those three areas, women's ability to answer these questions positively is undermined by physical and social factors. And there is our starting point for what we can start to do about it. Next slide, please. It's also really important to understand that safety is not, it exists on a spectrum of feelings and experiences, and that we cannot simply say that safety is about the most extreme precariousness. We also argue that simply being inconvenienced is a safety issue that mounts up over a person's lifetime if they are continually asked to take a longer route home or carry buggies upstairs. This inconvenience, which is founded all on exclusion from participating in urban development, is as an important safety issue for women as fear of extreme violence in public space. Next slide. I'm aware I need to end. So, really, the premise of the report is to encourage experiments in participation. That we acknowledge that the foundation of women's lack of safety in public realm is exclusion from the design process, and that our call to action is to encourage experimental ways in which women can be included, and to really do feminist action as doing it differently and being willing to take risks and think differently about urban development. Next slide, please. And we can skip that, I've just said that. Okay, so the recommendations that we finally give, I was a little bit told off at the beginning for giving 100-ish guiding questions that urban designers can use in any project, and I was told that's completely ridiculous. So we've put it down into three key sections of the urban design process, and have 10 overarching key actions that people can take in the process of production of urban space, both in terms of understanding what the issues are, making and programming and using that space. And so there are 10 key actions, but I managed to keep in the sub actions that can really hold a bit more of the nuance. And these guiding questions are intended to be provocations rather than solutions. They're questions, not answers, because we believe in the agency of women who are designing that space, as well as the designers. We're not providing a simple checklist of how to make this safe for women. That is evolving, and it necessarily be co-produced. Thank you. Next slide. And this is just to hand over to Terry to talk about next step.
Yeah, so thank you, Ellie. So something about our timelines for this. Phase 1 is going to complete this summer, and then the testing of the questions and experiments in participation with live development projects will start in the autumn. So we're looking and aiming to collect as much data as possible, evaluation and learnings, so that we can inform the review of those questions which have been highlighted to create a larger piece of design guidance, and that will occur next year. So keep watching this space. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're at the end of our presentations, and I am going to hand over to my colleague Tiffin, and she will be chairing a panel discussion. Thanks everyone for brilliant presentations.
Thank you, Marina. And yeah, thanks to all the speakers for their presentation. It's really, really good to see the work that is being done and that there is even more on the way to address gender equality in the public realm. I think it really gives me hope. It's also really refreshing to look at the discussion in the Q&A. I found that really interesting to see how much interest there is in the topic, and also, yeah, really gives me hopes for the future. So I am Tiffin Kagazian. I'm a senior planning manager at LLDC. I work on new development that LLDC is delivering on its land as part of the regeneration of the Olympic area. So I do have a vested interest to understand how to improve the development coming forward, really. And I have to say, I've been in the industry for more than 5 years, almost 6 now. But it's only the work that we've been doing over the last year with Marina as part of the LLDC Safety of Women and Girls Project Board that I really started to think specifically about how, as an industry, we approach those issues of gender inequality when we build our cities. And I have a lot of questions. I know the audience have a lot of questions as well. We'll do our best to pick it up. There were some questions that I think are probably easy to answer. I'm going to do it now. The video will be available at the end, the recording, as well as the slides. So those questions are answered. They're the easy one. And I'm really delighted to be here today to dive a bit deeper into the topic during a panel discussion. I'm also really excited to invite two more panelists to join us. So Sarah Hughes, who is an associate director at MACE, and also the co-founder and co-chair of their EDI network, Women at MACE. And I'm also inviting Anna Wendt, who is a partner at Bureau Apple, to join the panel. Welcome you both. Anna, I'm going to start with you. As a partner at Bureau Apple, you have an expertise in inclusive design, and you're working with developers on new development coming forward around the UK. We've heard from our speakers about really interesting and important research coming forward. But I think it's also important to understand how this topic is addressed currently in new development, what is being done. And I think one of my take from what I've heard is that while there is legislation that requires the built environment to be accessible, there is no really specific policies yet in terms of gender equality. So in that sense of like specific policies, from your experience, how often do you see the issue of gender inequality addressed in project or design brief? And then do you have any practical example of situation or project where you've included specific design solution in relation to this issue?
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me, and great start question. So I think policies do exist in some areas, but I'd certainly argue they're not clear enough or tangible enough to be easily translated into project briefs. Policies tend to sort of recommend that public realms should be inclusive or accessible, or should consider gender, or, you know, kind of designers should think about how it impacts the design. But as I say, it's not specific enough, and I don't think there's quantifiable metrics in the space being incorporated into project briefs often enough, and it leaves too much room for interpretation. Gender's arguably one of the most widely considered demographics that we're trying to accommodate into design, and yet we're still severely lacking in the space. And once, you know, we talked, a few people have mentioned intersectionality. So when you start thinking about, well, how are we designing specifically, say, for example, Black women or Asian mothers or elderly women or disabled women, it becomes so much more complex. And when we don't have clear metrics in our briefs, and there's not that clear guidance, and there's limited data, you know, there's increasing amounts of research, but we need that to drive our design decisions. And I think currently clients and designers are not prioritizing these aspects because other criteria are shouting louder for compliance. I think we, as a construction industry, we need to take more responsibility for driving that policy change, and we're seeing examples of that with some of the people that have presented today. But we also, as designers, need to take accountability for embedding it into our design and taking action where we can. So at Bureau Happold, we're a multidisciplinary consultancy, and we're involved in projects advising, you know, the client right from developing their brief, as well as implementing and delivering design solutions and engineering solutions. So we have a powerful position and we need to utilize it. So what we have a huge number of specialists, and so many of those specialists influence public realm design, responding to the challenges that I mentioned around us needing more tangible data points and quantifiable metrics. We've created this customized placemaking framework, and it provides a platform for measuring and tracking and understanding performance, and it's aimed to bring value from the point of selecting the site right through to project completion. And we actually pull in sustainability and biodiversity into that platform as well, because we think that considering the well-being of individuals is key to produce positive places, as well as ensuring that we're enhancing the environment. And what ultimately underpins that framework is two things. One is data and the other is cross-disciplinary collaboration. And the framework and platform is powerful in that it allows us to draw on a broader basis of data and evidence, but critically ensure that the interventions that we're developing are specific to the project in question. You know, as we've heard, it's not one size fits all. There's not one solution. We have to be very conscious about the particularities of the space and the place that we're trying to create. And the framework provides that leverage to make sure that we're prioritising and monitoring throughout the project specific things related to gender, inclusion, you know, accessibility, all those sorts of things. So just to touch on, if I can, the data, first of all, you know, comes from stakeholder engagement, and we recognise it's really difficult to provide metrics around things like feeling safe or engagement. And the most powerful strategy that we've adopted is simply asking representative groups about how they feel. And historically, I'd say the design team, particularly engineers and specialists, in many instances have been far too detached from the users of the space. And when we're trying to think about all of the different disciplines that are collaborating and influencing the design, and it can be architects, landscape designers, economists, you know, security consultants, lighting designers, sustainability, there's so many. But what we've seen historically is that the individual requirements from each specialist area get translated in quite a siloed, layered fashion. And so you miss those opportunities for the broader holistic solutions that really answer the things around sort of gender inclusion and equity. And they're extremely difficult to boil down to numbers because they're so subjective and related to the emotional and personal experience. So we have to couple that deeply integrated resolution of the design issues with the feedback from the user groups, and you know, kind of that helps us tackle the more nuanced outcomes. So just to give a project example, we're working on George Square in Glasgow. It's an 8-year-long project with Glasgow Council they're regenerating the area, and they're keen to approach the project in this more holistic way. And Bureau Happel, we've been appointed, we're providing security, safety, well-being, environmental, inclusive design and heritage input. And what's different about this project is that those disciplines have been brought in a lot earlier than they typically would. And we're able to inform the consultation and the stakeholder engagement process, assessing and testing ideas, starting to implement the framework that we have and putting the data into it and analysing it, testing opportunities and challenges and so on with the key users of the space prior to even deciding what the brief will be or what the strategy will be, and certainly ahead of implementing any design solutions. So in sort of getting that opportunity to provide a clearer brief, and we're also helping interpret the policies that exist and the building regulations that have to be met, but then quite importantly, looking at stretch targets that very specifically consider amenities and demographics, and also future-proofing the space, you know, making sure that we're considering changes in society and trends that are going forward. And by drawing on that wider set of specialist knowledge and taking into consideration that user data and the feedback that we get from people, we can get that more considered and very specific brief that also critically adds that real level of humanization to the requirements around aspects of gender and accessibility and so on. So it's really an emerging and developing approach that we have, but I think the key thing is having tools that really allow us to monitor and measure what we're doing throughout the project, and reprioritizing these aspects right to the top of the agenda from the absolute outset of the project.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, so interesting and so relevant, and I feel like a lot of potential developer in the audience, and surely myself, could take quite a lot from what you just said, particularly around participation and that the importance of cross-disciplinary approach, I guess, making sure all aspects are considered. And I think, I mean, it's a perfectly to Sarah's role. So I'm turning virtually to Sarah Hughes at MACE. So you're an associate director. MACE is a global organization shaping the built environment at all levels, so really influencing from development and consultancy to construction and operation. And MACE employs over 5,000 people in a fairly male-dominated industry. So I'd say MACE is in a unique position to really influence the issue of gender inequality within the industry, on the building site, and the places that you make, or also in the workspace. And I just wanted to know whether you agree with Anna's take in terms of the importance of participation, and I think it's a fairly uncontroversial question, but Anna's take on the importance of participation and cross-disciplinary involvement, and how MACE is doing it in new project. What is the developer's take on this issue? And if you have any project that you can refer to, that would be brilliant, because I think we're learning a lot from the speakers. Case studies are really important. Seeing what others are doing is really important. So yeah, Sarah, it'd be great to have your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Tiffin, and thanks for having me. And I think the quick answer is I emphatically agree with Anna, and also share your view on the insights we've learned today. It's been amazing to see the kind of evidence base and where the research is and where it's going, and also seeing some just brilliant real life examples. I wanted to transport my younger me into some of those spaces sort of straight away, and it's brilliant to see what applied effort can do to sort of bring, inclusive spaces to life, and I think they spoke for themselves really. As you said, Tiffin, at MACE we span across the life cycle of delivery, so from property development all the way through the design and the construction stages and into operations of buildings. So I think we have quite a broad perspective. And it's been fascinating the last couple of years co-chairing our network group, as you said, the Women at MACE group. So I think we exist in quite an interesting space in the property development sphere. So while there is legislation, as we know, that requires the built environment to be accessible for all, I think we've all established on the call so far that it doesn't always translate into safe and inclusive spaces without sort of an application of effort. And as investors and developers, we're often in a position to set the brief for projects, and we bridge that gap sometimes between policy at sort of the inception, and there can often be quite a long period of time before the design is in play and being realised. So I think this is where our responsibility lies, and our opportunity as well as developers lie to really direct attention and project resources into that space, because I think, as you said, without the application of effort, there are many competing demands on projects, and other things can subsume that. And just to quote Sarah at the beginning, I think when women plan and design cities, they do it with inclusivity in mind, and that's something, I think again we all recognise, and we've been looking at from a number of different perspectives within MACE. So sort of tackling it, we've mentioned that construction and property development can be very male dominated, and MACE is no different. So we've been looking at things from various different angles, so within our own organisation, and looking at what the tone and the culture is, and addressing any issues that might be there in the workplace and on projects. From a Women at MACE perspective, we've very much been not just looking at top-down as well as we have been looking at top down as well as bottom up initiatives, and I think sometimes it's in that middle bit where the exciting things happen. So we have a really engaged board and senior leadership team who are very alive to some of the sorts of issues and challenges that we've been hearing about today. And we're quite clear, not just about the commercial imperative for tackling some of these issues, but the moral imperative as well. And I think we've sort of touched on both of those. We're very invested in our behavioural framework, Behaviours for Success, which supports and communicates best practice and inclusivity and collaborative behaviour. We've introduced tools, toolkits within the business, sort of organisational tools and allies charters to support women's allies, to visibly demonstrate and support and challenge people. That sort of culture we're bringing to our site activities. So Mace is well known for being a big contractor, so at a practical level. We're looking to tackle access into the industry to make sure it doesn't continue to be male dominated in perpetuity, and looking at what are some of those barriers for women in the industry. So we've introduced things like personal insight risk assessments that consider all aspects of experience, and I think somebody earlier was talking about the journeys to places. It's not just the place itself, and that includes your workplace environment. So how do people get to work, what are their experiences along the way? They're all very relevant in terms of how people access whatever space they're going to, whether it's a public space that they want to occupy or if it's a workplace. We're tackling things like PPE, which I know is always a hot topic for women, and inclusivity challenges. We've launched a task force to investigate appropriate PPE for women, and we're looking at site-based activities as well, including on the one of the LLDC sites where we've just launched poster campaigns. So doing very visible campaigning to create the right environment for women to succeed and reach their full potential. In the actual spaces that we create, so I think we consider ourselves to be creators and curators of the physical environment. Women at Mace, we've got a key work stream this year which we're calling Safe and Inclusive Spaces, and we've been working closely with LLDC on their initiatives and sort of sharing ideas and sharing thoughts on that. So we're really trying to spearhead that work within our organisation, looking outwardly at the spaces that we develop, build and operate in, to make sure that we're serving the intersectional agenda, as well as in particular focusing on the women's issues and access to spaces. On a very practical level, working with designers such as Anna and people like that, you know, we do quite a lot of regeneration projects, and the quote from Leslie Kern, "No amount of lighting can abolish the patriarchy." I'm still sniggering, I love that quote, but lighting is important, as we all know, and it can really contribute to a feeling of safety. So thinking a project in mind, and yesterday talking to a designer for a space we built a couple of years ago, and just rehashing the conversations that we were having during the design stage as we were formulating the brief and agreeing on the right type of response that was specific to that space, around things like lighting, the right levels of lighting, making sure the edges are lit, not just the middle, and having to be a little bit creative, you know, with some of the legislation, some of the policy around things like lux levels. You know, we're really diving into the detail here, but you know, one answer could have been shine a spotlight in the middle of the space. Well, that can hinder rather than solve the problems of safety. You know, implementing the use of oversized benches, which encourages dwell time, different types of seating, oversized seating that older people can occupy with the right level of seating, younger people have somewhere to occupy, sit in groups. It's a sociable place to meet, which serves to hopefully increase dwell time. It does. We've seen the evidence. Post-occupation encourages people to use the space, and that starts to, you know, add to a feeling and perception of safety, because there's natural surveillance, and really to sort of follow some of those key design principles of things that we know works. So Thank you very much. It's fascinating to listen to everyone today, and it's great to be able to contribute to this conversation, and I look forward to hopefully working with all the people on this call today in the future.
Right, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's really interesting, and the issues that you mentioned and the competing requirement about lighting and what actually is required in policy, it does echo to a lot of element I see on my project, and we've identified in our consultation that LLDC conducted last year as well. So these are really topics that I think needs to be dived in a little bit more. But I think also, I'm just trying to follow the Q&A, and it is someone saying that it's key to not push to the converted, and I think here the work that you're doing on your construction site, where you've got potentially people that might not think about those issues on a daily basis, I think is really important. And that's something that's been identified actually by a lot of respondents to our consultation. Construction site can feel intimidating, and we know because LLDC is an area with a lot of construction sites. So improving that interim period, I think, is also really important. And I think here kind of makes me move to the fact that we do have a lot of research that is currently being undertaken, and a lot of projects are starting to look at those measures and solution in more detail. But what do we do for projects that are on site now, for projects that are built? And we know how long it takes to design and build a project and create a new piece of the city. So how do we ensure that spaces that are already created, or spaces that are already designed, can be retrofitted or improved upon, so women don't have to wait another 10 years to feel included in the space, if that makes sense. And I kind of want to turn to Terry, because I know, Terry, you actually have to leave us in about 8 minutes, so I'm hoping. So Terry, you're a mayor design advocate, and I do feel you're in a key position, right, to kind of like have a look at those issues and advise developers on the topic. I just wanted to know, how do you embed that in your role as a mayor design advocate?
Okay, so one of the key ways in which we implement that is through our design review process. And we've, highlighted that there's a shortfall in the evidence on safety in design, which is why the research was is being undertaken to provide more information and guidance to those of us who are undertaking the design review process, as well as other designers who are interested in this useful information. In the interim, we don't want to wait for years till everything is published. I think collating all the good practice that exists already, which is part of the first phase of our research, which should be available shortly, is a great way of using the existing information while additional research is ongoing, and which is why events like this, where we're sharing the information, is really quite useful, but also collating it in a single place, or being able to signpost people to where the information is also really quite useful. And this is something which we'll continue to build on, because we're never quite there. It's a journey, not a destination, because as we discover more about, the safety, how people experience it, things will change over time. So it's an ongoing process. Let's just collate all good practice that we have at any one time, and not wait for, the big, research or the big publication to be available before we implement change.
Right, thanks, Terry. And yeah, I think I subscribe to what you said, and the case study that we've seen today are a really great starting point, I think, to start and reflecting. And one question I had, and I'm actually going to turn virtually again to Pablo here, is that we've heard a lot about international case studies around the globe today, which is fascinating. But just, as a lot of people said, don't want to lose sight of the fact that women are not one homogeneous group. And I know you've done research both in Latin America and in the UK, and I was just wondering if you can tell us how you see culture and background influence on our perception of the built environment, and how, if it's possible at all, it is to look at recommendation based on case study, let's say Santiago de Chile, and apply them in Stratford in East London. How do we ensure that we're not tailoring it to the right local group?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's super interesting. So essentially what I presented there, they are publications, right? So it's evidence that applies to particular cases, but my project is about building actually methodologies that can be place and people specific. So what would be exported from the case of Santiago, I think is not really the result of that research, but the method that could be applied, for instance, in whatever new development. You could simulate what is the actual perception of safety of that space, where are the kind of clusters of fear of crime, and then test as many possible solutions as people propose, all based on theory, and then kind of doing this ranking about what works. I think that would be a super interesting approach. So my main commitment is about building the platforms for implementing this in any site. And the issue of intersectionality and culture is about, from a quantitative perspective, is about the sample size. So I have run research with around 3,000 people, and with that you really can get into the intersectionality, for instance, of ethnicity, different ages, and certainly seeing which are the most essentially affected or vulnerable people. And then you can design something and select projects with that gender and intersectional perspective. So to summarize, is less about the lessons, more about the method and how we can implement robust evidence-based solutions that actually works, and kind of have this responsibility about public investment, but as well solving the problem that we really want to solve, and it's essential for improving the quality of life of everyone in a city.
I think it's a really good point. It's actually really interesting, and I think that methodology can actually give really good tool for designers and developers and local authorities actually to push forward this agenda. And I feel like here what I hear is the emphasis on participation. We need to get people around the table to tell us how they feel, and then look at how they could feel. Well, they could be more integrated in the design process. And I know Susanna is doing a lot of work with local groups and local communities, and obviously teenage girls. And I know from our experience at LLDC of conducting a consultation on this topic, how hard it can be to reach out to some specific groups, and teenage girls were one of them. So I just wanted to know, Susanna, given this importance that we put on participation, how do we ensure that participation is inclusive as well, and we reach out to all the relevant group, even when sometimes they're not the one coming forward by themselves in a more traditional way, if that makes sense?
Yes, that's a really good point, because so often in where we operate, the way that you do a consultation is you speak to the park users, which means you never get to speak to the people who aren't using the park. So again, it's one of those, how long is a piece of string? It's very dependent on where you are, but we have to actively reach out to girls groups, to youth groups, to schools to speak to girls, but also you have to persuade girls that it's something that matters to them. And I think this is the other thing, because we've all institutionalized this idea that there's just some things that we don't do as women. And basically Make Space for Girls came about because I read Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women, and she's just got a few pages about parks, and I'd never seen it before. I am a feminist. I have a teenage daughter. It simply hadn't occurred to me. And this is true. It's true for a lot of practitioners, but it's also true for the girls themselves. They don't see themselves, they don't see parks as being relevant to them. So we have to do a kind of longer form consultation that firstly gets them thinking about parks and public space in quite a general way, about how they might want to feel, about, how did they use parks when they were younger. And only by engaging them slowly can you actually get them to interact with a proper consultation, because they just don't see it as being for them. And I'm sure that must apply in many other groups as well. The other answer is that love to shop vouchers work really well for ensuring participation in consultation. Don't and Costa apparently I hear are doing very well as well. But actually incentivizing, and we're doing some very interesting work with the LSC at the moment with Dr. Julia King, because the other problem is about a power imbalance, and I think this applies to everybody, a knowledge imbalance. So she's running kind of informal apprenticeships through the LSE, and we're doing that with a group of teenage girls over the summer, where they are educated to take part in the planning process. You know, they find out about planning. We're doing some urban mapping work to find out how they use public space, but they will do a 6-week curriculum about how all of this stuff works before we talk to them, and then they will be peer researchers. So I think that knowledge imbalance is also important, is also something we need to think about in consultations.
I mean, completely agree. And I think that's something that we see when we do, let's say, more traditional planning consultation as part of the planning process in the UK, and getting the right stakeholders and individuals involved is so important. And I know, Sarah, you're doing, Sarah, I can direct you now, turning to Arab, you're doing a global research, obviously, so you interact with a lot of different stakeholders, and I'm sure you've got an idea of who needs to be involved very much from the outset. And it would be great to hear, like, if I'm looking to do a new development, who should I consider? Is there a checklist, something that I could use to ensure that I'm not missing anyone that needs to be at the table?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. I think, yeah, because as we said, to address a complex topic like this, there is a need to involve different experts and different disciplines. But what I think is important is at the end, who takes decisions, who takes the final decision. Because also through the engagement to develop the publication, we organized a couple of workshops. Many participants, 90% were women. So sometimes the feeling that women talk about the problem, but then at the end, men take decisions based on the perceptions of women, that in many cases is wrong. So there is something that needs to change, because we have been talking about safety of women, and I said this is only one of the topics that needs to be addressed. We've been talking about that for the last decades, but nothing has changed much. I mean, it's still like an emergency that we need to address on top of all the other things. So there is a need for a radical change, and in order to change radically something, men need to be involved. So they are kind of the main stakeholders that need to be involved in understanding what are the real needs. Because normally, what is so men kind of switch off their brain when you start to talk about designing for women, because they say this is not something that relates to me. I mean, what is the difference between designing a city for a man or for a woman? Of course, there are also great architects and urban planners who are very sensitive to these topics. But unfortunately, the majority, including Arab, they think, what's the difference? Why should I consider women? It's just a city, or, you know, the human-centered approach is important. At the same time, you also need to be specific in terms of which humans are you talking about, and which age groups are you talking about. So just to make it short, this really is a multidisciplinary approach, needs to involve everyone in the life cycle of the project, as it was said by Mace, for instance, or others. If you want to deliver on the ground these great principles, you need to make sure that it's simple. You need to make it simple. So we need to embed these design principles into the life cycle of projects, from the conception of the project to the procurement, to the contracting, to the implementation, to make sure that these principles are really mainstream in the contract with the contractors. And you need to train them on how to implement these principles. With Mace, we did great work in Peru on this, for instance. So it's complex. The stakeholders need to be involved. And I think the simple way is to look at if the project needs to deliver, look at the life cycle of that project, identify the key stakeholders that take decisions in each of these phases, and what are the key stakeholders that can influence each stage, and make sure that they are involved, men, women, kids, any group needs to be involved in different stages of the process, depending on their role responsibilities. But this has to be really integrated into the way we do work, because there are so many great case studies and so many ways to be inspired. But at the end, who takes the decision has to be involved in understanding fully what it means and what it's about.
Thank you, Sarah. It is, yeah, it is so right. And I think because of the way the industry is shaped at the moment, as you say, men are most likely to be at those positions where decisions are made. And although I think we are all trying and doing our best for the sector to be more diverse, we will have to live with that situation a bit longer. So in the meantime, we don't want to lose that kind of time frame and yeah, lose that opportunity. And I was just wondering, because obviously you're going to publish as part of the work with the GLA guidelines and guidance, and I know they focus on design, but will they also address the structure of design team and the decision-making process? And if so, can you, with a sneak peek, or is it something you can share with us today as to how we ensure that men are more aware of the inequalities and take that into account when they make decisions?
Absolutely. So there's I presented this 3 parts of the project lifecycle: understanding, making, and using. But actually, in the last weeks, we've kind of realized realized that a lot of our understanding was really project structure and project setup. So actually, that's where we have most of our recommendations and questions, because that's where a lot of the power of the design team kind of sits. So the kinds of questions that we ask ourselves, I have it here, is project leadership prioritizing inclusion? So is this a named priority by project leaders who can articulate that well and describe for this project what we mean by gender inclusion, rather than, you know, being quite generic? What does it mean for this project in this space? Another one is the project team itself gender informed and diverse? So we know that diversity in the design team is a key factor, but we also know that just simply having a diverse team doesn't mean you have gender expertise or racial expertise. And so great to have, but also ensuring that the appropriate training, expertise and skills are in place, and that there is someone responsible in the design team for ensuring that this is maintained as a priority and understood and interpreted for the project. Finally, another question is around appropriate resourcing and budgeting. This is incredibly important, because it's very good and well to say we've got a diverse team and we have it as a priority, but if it's not supported by practical time for engagement, where we're really valuing people's time. Somebody spoke about, I think it was Susanna, who spoke about vouchers, really work for participation. We can say that's a throwaway comment, but it's incredibly important, because it's about paying people for their labour, for participation and the value and expertise that they are bringing to projects. So I think it's absolutely essential that we value the type of work that women will need to be doing in order to participate, because women, as we know, have a huge amount of unpaid labour in their lives already. And so these are just a few of the ways that we can think about projects set up for success. And I think you asked at the very beginning, if I may, about spaces or projects that are already built. And how can we, what do we do if we've got a space? And I think that's, that's an essential question. We can think about how do we use and manage a space best when we're creating it. Not that we ever create a space, there's already a space there. We're always adapting and repurposing space. But I think there are kind of 2 key ways in which we can think about programming and management of spaces. The firstly is, do we have appropriate policies in place about the ways in which we can the space can be used? And I think it's come up a few times here around kind of women's only spaces in order to empower. And I think that again, if we think about, like, I guess I commented that women's only carriages maybe are treating as women as victims, but there are other women's only, and that is simply because it's a limiting factor rather than a emancipatory factor. And so there is substantial evidence to say that when you do create spaces for women, girls and gender minorities, actually that can increase their use of the space at times. So if you had a skate park, for example, that has like 1 hour only for women and girls, it means they can become proficient. It signals without being subject to male gaze. They can understand, or it signals to them that this space really is for you, and that spills over into kind of 24-hour use of the space as well. And finally, and I stopped talking because okay, well, there's a disagreement over here, but anyway.
And I feel like I need to give a voice to Susanna, because I can see you were shaking your head a little.
Yeah. One thing that's really worth saying, and it applies across the board, is that there is a massive absence of data in everything, very specifically in our area. Literally, people build hundreds, probably thousands of Mugas, you know, on a 5-year basis, but there is not one piece of research about who actually uses them. So there is a bit more research about skate parks, but actually the Undercroft at the South Bank has been doing some research on trying to increase uptake, and their experience was they did sessions for girls and young women, and they got the uptake. It made very little difference to the actual continuing usage.
I would argue that the South Bank Centre is a particular example because it's a space where people go to observe skaters as well, rather than being a private space. So you're always going to be subject to male gaze at that place.
Absolutely, but we would argue that the design of skate parks, actually the bowl-like design of skate parks, creates a lot of spaces that, you know, that are very gladiatorial and bowl-like, and so that design needs to be unpicked before girls participate. What does work are indoor skate parks. The participation rates for girls, where they run girls only session and then girls feel empowered to join in, because you have some adult, you know, authoritative moderation of the space. Boys feel they have such a right to spaces like skate parks and Mugas that they actively drive off girls, and literally rape threats, throwing stones, racial abuse. And the girls tell us this with pride. It's like, yeah, we've got through this and we all still skateboard, but those are probably the 2 out of 20 who've taken it. Because it's this idea that you've got an unmoderated space, the strongest group will dominate. I think in other areas of park life, which boys don't see as theirs, I think activations are enormously important and can really help, because the best way to bring more teenage girls into the park is to bring more teenage girls into the park. But boys territorialize these spaces so strongly that activations alone don't seem to work unless you can add in people who are monitoring the space.
I think, yeah, I mean, these are both really valuable take, and I think, I mean, the way I see it, and maybe it's what I picked from what I've heard, is that there is something that needs to be done now, and it might be that now we can have some kind of like time slot allocated for girls in some specific areas, but then ultimately it's the design of the space that needs to change. But as we know, designing takes time, especially if we're doing properly with appropriate consultation. So it's probably a bit of both that we need at the moment, in my opinion.
I'm just going to say one thing very quickly. We're actually launching, it's based on a lot of research from Sweden, a design for what a more inclusive, girl empowering skate park might look like on Tuesday, on Go Skateboarding Day. So watch our Twitter. We've worked with a skateboard designer to create something that precisely stops this, hey, you're all staring at me, and would open up a skate park to more girls.
Well, that's brilliant, and I'm sure a lot of people here will tune in. We're getting to the end of the session. Unfortunately, there were so many other points I wanted to cover. I feel the question of participation and the time and budget it takes from a developer point of view is really interesting, because obviously that's something that needs to be factored in the project, and that's definitely an added cost because that's what it is. Time is money, and obviously budget is always tight on the development. So it would be really interesting to see how developer can work on making that time and that budget available. And I know Sarah probably has a lot of ideas on it. I don't know if people are okay to stay maybe for another couple of minutes. I'm just gonna give a voice to Sarah Hughes, see how if that's something you've been doing on your project already in terms of like having maybe a longer participation in consultation process than traditionally in the built environment, and then if you've seen any like results from it.
Thanks for giving me the floor again, Tiffin. It's an interesting question because I think, as you say, time is money, and I said earlier that's, you know, that time between sort of the policy making and a design being delivered is the space we often occupy as developers. I think carving out, there's always a temptation to dive into some of the details, and we've touched on loads of fascinating details, and we've also zoomed back up to strategy. And I think it's really important because this is such a multi-layered, multifaceted topic, and there's so many things to kind of solve with this. It's really important to start with a strategy and look at the why. So the way we approach things and the way Women at Mace have advocated this sort of approach within our business is to always start with why and what are you trying to achieve, and don't assume that you always know the answers. So I think, you know, some of the discussions today have been really, you know, insightful and enlivening, and it's generated debate as well, because there isn't always a one-size-fits-all solution. So the way we advocate and approach is to start with a strategy, look at what you're trying to achieve, and what are your project goals, and that's the best way, I think, we feel to bring the right people on board and hear the right voices and make sure that people have a voice, because at the end of the day, you know, we were talking about the importance of allies. You know, one of the things that we did last year, what we found incredibly successful and engaging within our own business, was sparked by the tragic death of the tragic murder, I should say, of Sarah Everard, was a series called Breaking the Silence, where we invited our colleagues to talk about their own experiences, and we found an incredible level of engagement particularly from the men in our business, who I don't think we can always assume that people do know the challenges. So somebody earlier made the comment about preaching to the converted, but I think that series of events that we ran, that were internal events, was really eye-opening for people, and I think sometimes it was the first time somebody had heard that their wife or their partner or their colleague felt unsafe or walked down the road with the keys in their hand, and, you know, making that space to understand the topics and then engaging people, translating that knowledge as an ally or whoever you are in the process, and then running with it to develop the strategy and carve out appropriate time and resource to then build a toolkit around what we need to do. That's, I think, the best way to tackle some of the issues and make sure, as I say, right people are on board and you're deploying those resources to get to an end that you've all agreed on and that you all understand as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I think it's a brilliant way to conclude this session. It's a really good point to make, and I think it's good food for thought for everyone on this seminar. Yeah, I just want to conclude this discussion. It was really fascinating, and there's so much left to unpack. So I think, as my plea to you in the audience, please do continue that discussion, that conversation within your organization, within the industry, on projects that you're working on. We need people talking about it, reading the research, and then doing what they can now to address this issue, to ensure that obviously new development and the city is just a more inclusive and welcoming place for all, really. I'm going to apologize again for running slightly over time. I hope you find it interesting. Before ending the session, I just want to thank again all speakers and panelists. It was wonderful to have you all. Also, my co-chair has done an amazing job in preparing the session, so thank you, Marina, and the NLA finally for hosting us this morning. I hope everyone will have a brilliant rest of the day. Thanks again.